So, the translations are out for the most recent chapter of My Hero Academia, and let's just say that it is going to be a very tearful chapter with the potential death of a prominent character, as well as potentially the return of another character that we've been looking forward to. Yeah, it's going to be one of those chapters, so let's talk about it, but first, right after this. Hey guys, how's it going? It is your boy, Manga Man Drew, and I'm here to do my manga review for My Hero Academia Manga Chapter 402, The Tearful Days. And oh boy, if that title of this chapter doesn't tell you what's going to be going on in this chapter, then you're going to be really surprised. So yes, we are going to be reviewing this chapter for My Hero Academia, which for the most part from what we've seen, we have a strong focus on the actual fight between Deku and Tomura, as well as potentially having the conclusion of All for One versus All Might, as well as a little bit of characterization sprinkled in for both characters of Deku and All Might. So let's dive into the chapter and really talk about what's going on. And for starters, the beginning of this chapter is something very interesting and unexpected. We get a more confirmation of really how long the fight between All for One and All Might took place within. Because at the beginning of this chapter, we actually get more confirmation that everyone across the battlefield, or at least when it comes to the police officers, finally figured out that both Uraraka as well as Shoto were able to defeat their relative villains and are now responsible for the reasoning why the Toga Twice clones are disappearing. Where we actually get to see Momo as well as Mei Hatsume actually showing that they were fighting off these Twice Toga clones, as well as the confirmation for the reason why the UA flying coffin was actually falling, because it had a lot more weight on it than it should have, which was actually causing it to fall, but now it's able to float back into the air. So I'm actually kind of excited and kind of glad that we're able to focus on the other areas and to show that this is a war that is going on multiple fronts, and that every character is playing a role, whether it be big or small, in this final confrontation. As well as we get a little bit more focus on the fight between Tomura and Deku, as we get the police officers coming to a realization that All for One is close enough to Tomura to use the Gloop Warp Quirk. And from here, this is where we're going to be getting a little bit more into the fight, as well as getting more into the characterizations of the characters of Deku and All Might. Because as we get the reveal that All for One is able to use the Gloop Quirk, he attempts to use it on Tomura in this moment, but unfortunately Tomura still has a strong will to overpower the Gloop Quirk. And by overpower, I mean he just keeps his mouth shut, which is very funny to think about that being the main counter to the actual Gloop Quirk. But we also get to see a little bit more about how the Gloop Quirk works, as it requires for All for One to actually use it from the palm of his hand. And this is very interesting and continues from what we saw last chapter, with All for One being a little bit more composed in this moment and not overwhelmed by the emotions that were influencing him, most likely from Tomura, as he is able to ignore All Might in this moment and focus solely on getting Tomura to his location, which he fails spectacularly in, but he does have an alternative way of getting Tomura to his location. And that is by doing something that many people predicted or believed was going to be happening the next chapter, or this one, which is that All for One actually picks up All Might from his legs that are heavily broken and takes him to the location of Deku and Tomura. And this is a relatively smart move on All for One's plan, and he even chastises All Might about everything that he has done, putting the ideas of heroism into these students, and how that is more or less a crime coming from him. And this is where we get more of the characterization for Deku in this chapter, because we see that Tomura is chastising him. It's like, oh, are you gonna save All Might? Well, you know, if you do, guess what? I'm gonna kill everyone at UA, so what are you gonna do, Deku? As we just get a little bit of the inner monologue of what's going on in Deku's head at this moment, as he remembers his interactions with All Might, about how he's going to help All Might shape his fate, and that he's going to be doing it right by his side. And how he's trying not to cry in this moment, because he's been trying not to cry, living up to the words that All Might told him towards the beginning of this series, around chapter 2 and 3, where he wants to be sort of the perfect pupil, and by doing so, to achieve that ideal, he tried not to cry as much. which explains that throughout the story how he began to stop crying as much to the point where he stopped crying at all. But unfortunately, we see that in this moment, he is crying. He cannot hold back the tears, or at the very least, the symbolic imagery of the tears, of the energy flowing out of his eyes at this moment, which is very similar to how he felt when he saw that Bakugo was dead on the ground. But even with this characterization of Deku, what is even more interesting is the implication that we see within inside of the world of One for All, as we see that the flame vestige inside of him begins to fade a little bit as it seems to be saying farewell. And the indication of the flame disappearing inside of One for All could be an implication that All Might is about to die, or potentially adhering to a theory that I had, which is pretty much the idea, and I'm going to summarize it here, that when One for All was passed on to All Might, it became his quirk, and when he passed it on to Deku, it was still All Might's quirk, and that the reasoning why All Might was so gifted at the quirk was because he was the first quirkless individual to have One for All, and because it's still his quirk, he's still the only one that can use it efficiently without damaging his body. But the moment that he dies, that is when the quirk will become Deku's, and when he'll be able to use the full power of One for All without damaging his body. That is the theory that I have, and that this could be an indication of it due to the fact that the flame of All Might is actually fading away and disappearing. And that if he was actually going to remain within inside of the world of One for All, he should actually get more clearer instead of fading away. And the fading away is very much symbolic to how All Might and One for All faded away inside of him as the flame began to disappear. So it really adds to that theory that I've been saying for a while, so it's very cool to see that it's possibly going to be leaned into more, potentially. And yeah, as he calls out to All Might, that conclusion is very much apparent for what we're getting in this chapter, with the possibility of All Might literally blowing himself up. And that's not a hyperbole. He literally blows himself up. Because we even get him having an inner monologue about how he believed that Deku could be a hero even though he didn't have a quirk, and how he was so proud of him for being able to do his best, and that he was glad that Deku couldn't give up on his dreams in the same way that he's not going to give up on his dreams of being the symbol of peace. As we see that he grabs All for One's throat with a sort of gauntlet-like thing, which is most likely going to be the final support item and equipment that will be on par with what is symbolic for Bakugo, Dynamite being the only hero and student from Class 1A, which we didn't see incorporated into the armored All Might suit or the support items from Hercules. And as this is happening, with All for One thinking back to Nana Shimura for some apparent reason, but what is interesting about this moment is that it's actually sort of a continuation of a panel and chapter that we saw in My Hero Academia Volume 0, which, if I remember correctly, was a volume that was released during the first My Hero Academia movie, where we saw the more canonical fight between Nana Shimura and All for One, where we get that pretty much summarized partially in this chapter, but what we even get to see is more of that fight. We don't get to see all of it, but we get to see a large substantial part of it that was not shown in the manga previously. And how we see that she was heavily defeated by All for One, but All for One himself begins to think about the final moments of Nana, and like, why is he seeing it right now, as he thinks about how that woman was a fool, that she couldn't do anything without power, and that she died a pathetic death. But we get to see her retort in a very similar fashion to the second user, and how he smiled in the face of All for One at his death, and how she pretty much says that All for One is going to lose because Toshinori is just crazier than him, which leads to All Might himself declaring that one final kill will make him into a kindergartner, as we see the end of the chapter and a big white light explosion. And yeah, this fits very much with All Might's character. I mean, he has done a lot of crazy stuff. The willingness to like put himself in danger, to heavily injure his body, and the idea that he could be the symbol of peace are all crazy ideals that come from All Might, but it still very much fits within his character and his characterization. And for many people who believe that this may be out of character for All Might, this is most definitely within character with All Might as well as the previous users of One for All. Because once again, making parallels to the other previous users and how they died, from what we've seen, for the most part, they've died with All for One having their hands on their throats, as well as smiling in front of them, believing that they were able to get the upper hand upon All for One. And we see that Toshinori does the exact same thing, but this time the roles are reversed with him having his arm on All For One's throat. And pretty much this chapter implies that All Might is potentially dead in this chapter, but because this is shonen, and because this is My Hero Academia, I do not necessarily believe that All Might may be dead in this moment. Very much how I believe that Bakugo wasn't dead with his moment, as well as potentially what happened with Gran Torino. Now, is he heavily injured? Yes. And can he possibly die? Also yes. But along those lines, potentially Bakugo could be brought back into the story at this moment to actually rescue Toshinori in this moment. Because if you remember how the situation is going, his defeat is going to be televised across the world, as we saw with some of the people from the business course still recording in this chapter. And how when it came to Bakugo, he believed that he's the reasoning why All Might had to fail and step down as being the #1 hero. But if he's the one that is actively able to, if not stop All For One in this moment, actually save All Might, then that could actually be the redemption and a good end for his character, because we know for a fact that he is being brought back to life, and that we know for a fact that the very bare minimum 20 minutes have passed since his quote-unquote death, so it's very possible that he could be back up and active and being able to fight against either All For One, Tomura Shigaraki, or at the very least save All Might. So I think that this is going to be very dependent on how the next chapter goes, whether or not I feel satisfied with All Might's death in this moment. Because as it stands right now, I'm very much in the middle. I don't necessarily love it, but I don't necessarily hate it. I'm more of accepting that this may be the end for All Might, but I can't wait to see the next chapter, which is coming out in 2 weeks, unfortunately, for how his story may end. Also, a point of notice is that this may be, and I'm not sure if this is intentional or not, but it seems as if All Might in the final page is a little bit more sketchier than usual. Now, this could be a creative choice, or it could be just Horikoshi turned it in at the last minute, which may be the reasoning why he's going on a 2-week break. But I can say that that scratchy look does look great, as it seems to be incongruent with the explosion going on. But hey, that's just my thoughts on the chapter as well as my review. So let me ask you this. What did you think of the chapter? Did you like it? Did you dislike it? And do you think that All Might Toshinori is actually dead? Leave your thoughts down below. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel for more content like this. Do all that cool jazz, and hopefully I'll be able to catch you in my next video. Goodbye!